Alrighty, I'm going to move straight on into, we're in chapter 3 of Tom Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and The Angel Out Ahead. Chapter 3 is called Modes of Knowing and Levels of Being. And we were looking at the first section, which is called Thought and Being. And we were talking about sort of Cheetham and by extension Corbin's understanding of the importance of Gnosis, transformative knowing, in um, repairing this link between thought and being that they claim has been, and through Heidegger as well, has been sort of, uh, we've been severed through Descartes and sort of since the 12th century in Western culture. We have this cut between thought and being, what in Descartes was the res cogitans and res extensa. And the idea is to sort of knit ourselves back together by using phenomenology and um, thought conceived of as a transformational way of knowing more deeply, to sort of knit ourselves back together, bringing our metaphysical assumptions up into unconcealment, and so affording our own transformation. And obviously, the context for me, what I feel is the relevant context and introduction here are in the first 5 minutes of the first video of the series. And what I would say is it was a somewhat exhaustive, the sixth episode here. And it's because I really got hung up and frustrated with the relativity of philosophers. And so for me, there's this, it's definitely true to say that we can conceive of philosophy, right, in a deeper way. And we can realize that thought is actually a mode of being, and that by practicing this phenomenology and deeply engaging in what we're reading, that we can change ourselves, that we can be transformed in the Gnostic sense, and that this can really do something toward repairing and recovering what we've lost since since before the time of Descartes. However, at the same time, I think it's quite obvious to many people, although perhaps less obvious to philosophers, that philosophy is a minority occupation. And it, I don't know, I think in some way that the academy is a bit of a backwater and a bit obsolete in some ways. And I notice the relativity of thought itself, and I notice that there's a I don't know, I mean, for me, there's a very real sort of world situation. And I think to me, it feels that we're sort of obliged to do something about it. And that definitely involves more than just sort of thinking differently. You know what I mean? And I mean, I guess that's my own bias, but I don't see that, like, ultimately, I don't think that's avoidable. Um, the whole point of Gnosis is that it's about transforming the way that we are in the world, right? In this world, in this life, our life with our identity, these bodies, you know? Um, and I don't know, I notice one of the traps of Gnosticism and of philosophy is that they take us up. They take us up and out, up and away, and it's a way of bypassing and escaping. And I just feel that, yeah, I think for me, the new sort of sociological context that we're moving toward under Jordan Hall's civium is one way of thinking about it. Is that, yeah, the tribal context, the community context is a very different way of being situated in life. It's a very different place from out of which presence arises, or that at least conditions presence, meaning awareness. existential awareness or Dasein or being here. And so the question that's about to come is the question of practice, of the how. And I think although it's really profoundly powerful to reimagine philosophy as less abstract and more of a way, that can change the deeper aspects of our being, it's still something that deeply involves thinking. And unless we can recognize the relativity of thinking, I don't think we can recognize the relativity of thinking even within a kind of updated philosophy. I think the whole point of a ecology of practices is that we're bound within community and that we have, other things to do, quite frankly. Uh, so philosophy as luxury, not to say that it's not valuable. I'm not denying its transformative power, but I'm saying that there are other kinds of transformations that I think are also relevant. And I think philosophy is inherently prevented from helping us with that, even if we conceive of it in a broader and deeper way. But in any case, that sort of seems quite obvious to me. And I guess I'm pushing it here because it doesn't seem obvious to many of the academics that I know, including Viveki, including Tom Cheetham, who's writing this. When we're conducting our philosophy, when we're creating our systems of thought from out of a way of life that is deeply participating in that academy, I think I would say that the empirical evidence strongly suggests that that context has been woefully inadequate to respond to the world situation in which we find ourselves. And yes, I'm presupposing the validity of empirical observation, but yeah, it's from out of community that things are going to shift. It's from out of that context. And if we can take this powerful philosophy into that context, then great. But if we just keep sort of throwing ourselves at it, there are profound limitations to doing that, and also dangers. And that doesn't seem, I haven't found evidence yet that that is apparent to Corbin, to Cheetham, to Viveki. We're going to need more than new thinking. Okay. Now I'm going to continue. This is going to be a shorter one. I'm trying to be a little bit more efficient because I don't want to rant so much. So this is just a few pages here that finish off chapter 3. It's section 2. It's called a hermeneutics of presence. And so for Cheetham, this is in the context of having inherited this dualistic split between thought and being since Descartes and before that. And Corbin's prescription is a sort of to go back to, Sufism, or to look at the Islamic tradition as a way of sort of bringing back an imaginal way of healing ourselves by thinking in this Gnostic way. And so let's explore what more Cheetham has to say in a hermeneutics of presence. Quote, the question becomes one of practice. How? How do we overcome these schisms? Free ourselves from our self-imposed blindness and move outward into a wider world? How do we reveal our mode of presence and open our souls to the presences surrounding us? The critique I'm leveling is that they don't know how, and that I'm saying that they seem to think that the key is in hermeneutics, is in phenomenology, and I don't think that's I don't think that's the case. I think these traditions can play at most a contributing role, but the way is, as far as we know, ecology of practices, community of practitioners. Yes, with a viable worldview, but it's by noticing the different dualities that constitute us and taking perspectives on them through intentional group practice that we can facilitate emergence from the co-creative depths of our being, quote unquote, that can heal these splits. I know that was a little bit brief, but it's the how question, the skill question. The answer is not phenomenology. It could be a component of the answer, or the ecology of practices could have a phenomenological flavor. Anyway, we'll move on. Corbin says that it was Heidegger who provided the key with which to open the locks, closing him off from the other levels of being. Quote, the key is, one might say, the principal tool equipping the mental laboratory of phenomenology. The key is hermeneutics. Quote, the immense merit of Heidegger will always be that he centered the very act of philosophizing on hermeneutics. It is the art or the technique of understanding. This kind of understanding already implies transformation. It is not concerned with language as it is conceived by linguists or analytic philosophers, but with the language of the word of the theologians. This language is a cosmological phenomenon rather than a human creation. Language is a feature common to soul, to God, and to the world. Corbin stresses that the hermeneutic tradition that Heidegger continues stems from Wilhelm Dilthey and Friedrich Schleiermacher, and the theological practice of biblical interpretation. Corbin comments that many contemporary Heideggerians are happy to forget this connection. I might offer here that this notion of language being a cosmological phenomenon, I'm quite happy to buy into that. I think what we see is that a language, dance can be a language, visual art can be a language. We understand body language. You know, there's no inherent connection here between language and thought. And I think as soon as we, especially if we understand, if we notice that hermeneutics, as advocated by Heidegger, stems from out of biblical interpretation, well, the whole point of these traditions as being religious rather than simply philosophical is that they pertain to sacrament, to revelation, to visionary mystical experience, not simply to belief. And that's it. That's all. Those phenomena are profoundly embodied, you know, and it's, yes, thought can be embodied, but I think I've made my point. I'll move on. Corbin comments that many contemporary Heideggerians are happy to forget this connection to biblical interpretation. Quote, in Heidegger's analytic, the first task is the hermeneutics of itself, of the active presence. what I'm trying to point out here is that even if Heidegger is doing a very different way of philosophy, even if he's doing a philosophy which is entirely different than the philosophy of the last 2000 years, it's still clear that what he's doing is like sitting in his office a lot somewhere and writing and reading and changing his mind, changing his yes, he's doing phenomenology, but he's still very much embedded in and dependent on participating with the structures that are derived directly from the mode of being that we're trying to leave behind. And until we're willing to humble ourselves as thinkers and recognize that all of our thinking isn't getting us anywhere, I don't think we're going to keep getting nowhere. Anyway. In Heidegger's analytic, the first task is the hermeneutics of itself, of the act of presence. Corbin writes, quote, hermeneutics proceeds starting with the act of presence, signified by the da of Dasein. It has, therefore, as its task bringing to light how, in understanding itself, the human presence situates itself. Circumscribes the da, the situs of its presence, or sight of its presence, and unveils the horizon which was up to then hidden from it. Again, hermeneutics proceeds starting with the act of presence, signified by the da of Dasein. It has therefore as its task bringing to light how, in understanding itself, the human presence situates itself, circumscribes the da, the situs of its presence, and unveils the horizon which was up to then hidden from it. Complicated. Anyway, Cheetham. So far, this seems to be a straightforward explication of Heidegger's analysis. In fact, the notion of unveiling the hidden to reveal the truth of being plays a large part in his late work. But Corbin is traveling in wider circles than most Heideggerians. His grasp of hermeneutics and of the phenomenology that it makes possible springs not from the undoubted originality of Heidegger or Husserl, but from far older traditional conceptions of Sufism and Shi'ism. Nasser, again, who's an author of one book among others, Religion and the Order of Nature. Nasser, who taught with Corbin in Tehran for many years, writes, quote, Corbin used to translate phenomenology to the Persian-speaking students as Kashf al-Majdub, sorry for that, which is literally, quote, rending asunder of the veil to reveal the hidden essence. Rending asunder of the veil to reveal the hidden essence. And he considered his method to be spiritual hermeneutics, as understood in classical Sufi and Shi'ite thought. Without doubt, Heidegger provided the foundation for a bridge between Western philosophy and Islamic theology, but Corbin crosses it without hesitation to move into a more spacious world. As we've seen already, he emphasizes that to use the key that Heidegger provided by no means requires us to adopt his mode of presence. Quote, in Heidegger, arranged around this situs, or sight, is all the ambiguity of human finitude, characterized by being towards death. But this connection to the world, the pre-existential philosophical option, is itself a constitutive element of the da of Dasein, which we need not take as our own. Once we have truly realized this and become conscious of our unconscious decision, and therefore of our freedom to decide otherwise, the real meditation on our situation can begin. Quote, from then on, there is only to grasp as closely as possible this notion of presence. To what is human presence present? From then on, there is only to grasp as closely as possible this notion of presence. To what is human presence present? Okay, so what we've really been discussing here is how Heidegger provided us with this great bridge out of the materialistic, rationalistic scientism of sort of nihilistic Cartesian dualisms. I know that was a lot, but and so yay, Heidegger, he's giving us this hermeneutic key, and we can follow Corbin by saying, well, we can take the hermeneutic key from Heidegger and start to analyze the Da of Dasein, start to focus on our own presence. Wonderful. But we don't have to follow Heidegger in his being towards death. There's a way that Heidegger's presence is sort of conditioned in some way by his finitude, by his quote being towards death. And Corbin, through the sort of Islamic orientation to the world beyond death, or that which comes after death in a certain way, is wanting to leave behind this element of Heidegger and focus on presence in the same way, but to bring to bear some of the mythos, I would say, of the Islamic point of view and Persian point of view. And we're going to increasingly going to be exploring how he does that and what's important about it. Let's see what we can find. He says, Cheetham, for the spiritual theosophers and philosophers of Islam, quote, the presence that they experience in the world, lived by them, is not a presence of which the finality is death, a being towards death, but a being towards the other side of death. The transformation required for this kind of presence to open up for us requires the discovery or the recognition of a space adequate for this presence to reveal itself. The exploration of those spaces is the subject matter of Corbin's life work. Okay, I have to comment at this point. There's a reason that Ernest Becker's denial of death was so popular. Our being toward death, our relating with the event of death, is extremely deeply conditioned within our modern Western consciousness. And it is so clear to me, it's so self-evident that it's going to need more than even profound philosophical speculation to get us out of that. We can't, it's not easy for us to simply adopt a being towards the other side of death. Because just because it feels mythological, it feels medieval to us in a way that it's hard for us to adopt that perspective. We can't rationally, I feel, accept that as a way. And so then I'm going to say, well, that fact points us toward what's required for the transformation. As you said, the transformation required for this kind of presence to open up for us. So what would it require for us to relate toward death in a different way? So if in fact the way that we relate to death is very much conditioned by the absence of gnosis, the absence of mystical experience, conditioned by the way in which we're choosing to live, I'm saying that the real work that's required for us to open up the space that he's talking about, that's required for us to recognize or renegotiate our relationship with what we call death, that involves a lot of deep work, right? That involves a lot of deeply embodied, transformative work. I would say work that involves I can't, it's hard to explain what exactly I mean here. Again, it says, quote, the transformation required for this kind of presence to open up for us requires the discovery or the recognition of a space adequate for this presence to reveal itself. The exploration of those spaces is the subject matter of Corbin's life work. In my experience, the whole point of mystical experience, of transformative experience, is that it opens up space and that it's an emotional, existential, embodied space. Because the thing about death, in terms of the denial of death, is that we're afraid. And philosophy is not going to leverage that fear because it's deep fear. It's an instinctual fear, a primordial fear. It may also be true to call that fear metaphysical or ontological, but that's not the point. I'm saying that the way to open up those kinds of spaces is not in general by philosophy. I'm not denying that it may be possible to that philosophy might contribute, but I do in fact have personal experience and a lot of knowledge about how and why exactly those spaces open up. And this is the whole point of the spiritual is that it opens that spaciousness as a resource. And so it's from out of that spaciousness that we can then get a perspective on the way that we were looking at things previously. And but it's not just that, even that sounds quite heady still, sounds quite philosophical still. I'm saying that's a deeply emotional, embodied experience because there's a way, and I talk to people about this, and they tell me and this confirms my own experience. And yes, I do listen to the people that really love philosophy, so they think about it differently. So I don't think it's just confirmation bias, but it's like even people that can move through this stuff and read Corbin, it's like great, but there's a way that we kind of still come back to the cold hard reality of a Monday morning, and it's ultimately kind of just philosophy in a certain way, and unless it really does, in our earnestness, in the core of who we consider ourselves to be, unless it can actually shift that, then it's not going to do it for us. And my claim is that if we can recognize the empirical evidence for the transformative potency of mystical experience and of the optimal biopsychosocial conditions for that experience, and certainly those conditions can include an ecology of practices, that can include an imaginal element, can include philosophy, yes, but that's not the main part of the way. As just one example of among many, I happen to be a breathwork facilitator. I happen to practice a type of breathwork that's called rebirthing, and that involves what I would call genuine gnosis. It involves a transformative inner journey, and it's that can definitely involve insight. It can involve thought. It can involve knowing, in a deep way. But the whole point is that those kind of transformative journeys are deeply experiential, deeply not mental, not of the mind, and the mind is actually what's getting in the way, right? And and what's so effective about that kind of practice is that it opens up inner spaciousness. It opens up within the body, within our being. And it's very hard to describe what I mean by that unless you sort of, it's like we don't realize how much we're stuck in a little box. And until you practice transformative techniques in a way that breaks you out of that box, then you're not even going to know that you're in it. And there's a way that I feel that Corbin and by extension Cheetham and so on, it's the right kind of move, but it's still stuck within the box of philosophy. Anyway, again, I think I've made my point. It's just an example. I'm not saying that it's all about breath work or whatever, but, and yes, philosophy is important. I'm not denying that philosophy is important. Again, Court, for the spiritual theosophers and philosophers of Islam, the presence that they experience in the world, lived by them, is not a presence of which the finality is death, a being towards death, but a being towards the other side of death. The transformation required for this kind of presence to open up for us requires the discovery or the recognition of a space adequate for this presence to reveal itself. The exploration of those spaces is the subject matter of Corbin's life work. And so he will move beyond the confines of being and time by means of the very premises of that work itself. The decisive moment when he grasped the historicality of Dasein, its ability to stand apart from secular history, was so decisive because, quote, it was also without doubt the moment when, taking the Heideggerian analytic as an example, I was led to see hermeneutic levels that his program had not foreseen. Quote, I was led to see hermeneutic levels that his program had not foreseen. With this, the world opens up. Everything changes. The full existential importance of Heidegger's question of the meaning of being strikes home. Hermeneutics is the unveiling of modes of presence and of the worlds and the states of being to which they correspond. Hermeneutics is the unveiling of modes of presence and of the worlds and the states of being to which they correspond. It is itself a transformative act, since the understanding accomplished through hermeneutics changes the mode of being of the knower and reveals the hidden things. As we will see, the entire meaning of prophetic philosophy hinges upon the power of hermeneutics to lead the soul to new states of being. These modes of presence correspond to the mystical stations or makamat. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that again. Mystical stations, which are found in Sufism and Shiism. So this is it's a conception where different modes of being in the world are conceived of as kind of stations of the soul. And like I am finding a lot that's valuable about this. I'm not trying to reduce it to nothing. I'm trying to say, can we put this into the context of a whole lot of other stuff that's also helpful and recognize the importance of doing so. Chittick, I forget his first name, Chittick writes, human beings are infinitely diverse and ever-changing in their inward forms. A human being comes into the world as a potential divine form, but he or she may leave it as practically anything at all. An angel, a saint, a prophet, a devil, an animal, a vegetable. The stations are modes of being corresponding to specific virtues, which have their place in an ascending hierarchy leading to the divine. There is no possible distinction between ontology and ethics. Stations of the soul are both levels of being and moral virtues. Again, there is no possible distinction between ontology and ethics. Stations of the soul are both levels of being and moral virtues. Within the Islamic tradition, there are many descriptions of these stations along the way. As in climbing a mountain, quote, the beginning and the end are known as well as the major features on the way. But the actual number and the details of each step depend upon the climber as well as on the path and its beginning and end. Not long to go here, just a page. The hermeneutic of presence frees the soul from the narrow confines of the world into which it had found itself. The mode of being of the soul must change in order that it can be free for other levels of presence. And so their recognition and revelation mark a rupture with all that came before. Here we must turn to Suhrawardi, whose experience of the personal hermeneutics of the soul reveals the move beyond Heidegger. One night, during an intense period of meditation on the problem of knowledge, Aristotle appeared to Suhrawardi in a dream. He told him, "Awaken to yourself." Corbin summarizes the mystic's account of this meeting. Quote, then there begins a progressive initiation into self-knowledge as knowledge which is neither the product of abstraction nor a representation of the object through the intermediary of a form, of a species, but a knowledge which is identical to the soul itself, to the personal existential subjectivity, and which is therefore essentially life, light, epiphany, awareness of self, in contrast to representative knowledge, which is knowledge of the abstract or logical universal. What is in question is presential, unitive, intuitive knowledge, a presential illumination, which the soul, as a being of light, causes to shine upon its object. By making herself present to herself, the soul also makes the object present to her. Her own epiphany to herself is the presence of this presence. Her own epiphany to herself is the presence of this presence. The truth of all objective knowledge is thus nothing more nor less than the awareness that the knowing subject has of itself. The truth of all objective knowledge is thus nothing more or less than the awareness that the knowing subject has of itself. Okay, and then Corbin says, it's the power of this presence that breaks the frame in which the soul had been imprisoned. Okay, so that was a lot, right? And so it appears to me now that there is something that is profoundly valuable that it's here. There's a way this notion of the stations along the way I find compelling. Like I can see the connection here to, for example, parts work in IFS is an example. that the different parts are like different modes of being. Like I can see connections to drama, to improvisation, this kind of stuff. What do I mean by that? I mean that we can intentionally practice inhabiting different modes of being, that these could be conceived as connected with different sort of levels of the soul or different moral virtues. And I can see the value in that. I think to me, this is connected with a certain kind of flexibility and identity that we see in the world at the moment. There's a kind of what about in this mode, and how now about in this mode, and then this now about in this mode. Difficult to say what I mean by that, but there's a kind of flexibility there, a changeability, which can be powerful if we can participate deeply in those changes, rather than allowing them to be changes simply at the surface of things. I think we still see a lot of the limitations of philosophy here and how hard this is all to grasp. And if it can be brought down into practice, intentional practice, then I think it's maybe more relevant. I can also see how this is directly tied to sort of like stages of growth and development, but I'm kind of suspicious of stage models. Something like Jungian individuation, for example. Um, but yeah, I think um, I'll more or less leave it there. I will say, what else will I say? Let me see. What I'll say is that again, if we conceive of it in terms of liberation of the soul, I'm all for doing that. I think that's fine to conceive of it that way. But the whole point of traditions in the church tradition, the Gnostic tradition, the alchemical tradition, as well as psychology, that the soul is influenced. The soul is influenced by, you could say, the archetypes of the collective unconscious, or the Gnostic archons, or the planetary gods, or however you want to conceive of that which influences the soul. The idea is that um, it requires a way which is actually quite specific to account for that. It's like and yeah, I mean, they are offering a specific way here. And I think, I mean, maybe this is why maybe I can stop being a little bit critical and then say, can we take this idea of sort of moving from station to station on the sort of journey of the soul, and how can that comport with dealing with the different sort of archetypes of the collective unconscious, being sort of unveiling that which unconsciously influences us, participating in such forces consciously rather than unconsciously. And again, it's what's lacking here is that all of that is sort of this. That's all this oversight. We're overlooking all of that, and I think for transformations that come about through philosophy to really stick in an embodied way, there also needs to be. Well, I don't know. I don't think that's fair to say. I do think we can change ourselves and transform ourselves through the practice of philosophy, for sure. But I also think that um, I don't think of that as adequate to quote unquote liberate the soul. And I think, the condition of democracy, for example, like what about sharing this with the other people? I mean, I apologize for considering that to be important, but but I do think that that's important. Yeah, because otherwise it's just sort of, I don't know, built on an individualism that strikes me as more like lotus eating, selfish rather than, helping out. Because like no matter how much you talk about it to them, you're not going to get people to read Henry Corbin. And it's not about like being more persuasive. It's not about like, oh, let's actually read all the philosophy together. It's like it has to be it has to be brought down into the body. It has to be brought down into intentional practice. It doesn't require so much goddamn thinking. And even if we understand thinking as a much more, even if we can engage in thinking in a different way, well, yeah, I think I've made my point. So, but look, there's a lot that's profoundly valuable here, and I can see how this is beginning to become something that can usefully fit in to the broader context that I'm trying to point to as being necessary. Again, it's like the meta crisis is real, it's not made up. And if we're just bypassing that with philosophy, then it's not relevant to me. And it's also not admirable either. Burying your head in the sand comes to mind. And it's like to I also think that if you really want gnosis, if it's what it's really about is like enlightenment or whatever, awakening, then I actually think the community context is required. I think that we've been really blind to this is Thich Nhat Hanh, the next Buddha will be a sangha, a community. Even if you're oriented towards ecstasy, towards mystical experience, towards awakening, and you don't care at all about the meta crisis or anything like that, I think it's still in communities, in groups that the way is. And none of that is mentioned here at all. That's all bypassed. And there's a sort of I don't know, a vague, I mean, he's an ecologist for goodness sake, Cheetham, I mean, and it's sort of, oh, we're aware of this ecological crisis and the solution is to think differently. And I'm like, nah, nah, it's not. Maybe the viewer would think that being too harsh on Cheetham and we need people to think well. And I'm saying, I for one profoundly appreciate the importance of philosophy. I mean, look at me going through all this. But the kind of philosophy that is conducted within and arises from out of the context of communion, community, culture that can actually do something about the problem is way different. And like, even if we don't have anything to do with the meta crisis, even if it's just about, the virtue of living in community or whatever, I'm saying that the philosophy that comes out of that will be different. And that if look, all these guys are like amazing, profound guys, right? Corbin, Heidegger, Viveki, even Cheetham is like, wow, this is pretty cool. Like, well done, Tom Cheetham. But it's very academic. It's very what I consider to be detached. Anyway, I've kind of made my point. I just really care about it. I really it's because it's do you get what I mean? I mean, it's like to me kind of symptomatic. But again, a lot here is profoundly valuable. I'll have to leave it at that. I hope that I'm being I mean, this is in the context with the self-evident amount of like respect and appreciation that I have for all these people because I'm spending so much time with this. I'm not at all here just to like, oh, it doesn't work. No, I'm saying there's a lot here that really does work, but can we appreciate the significance of the prescription to move to local community, to have a whole ecology of practices, including dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied elements? And frankly, stuff like, do you know how to garden? Can you cook? How are you, it's like There's a lot else that's kind of important. Does it grow corn? Does it grow corn?